All right, this is Block 5, the Roaring Twenties. Section 2, Return to Normalcy, the section starting with frustrated farmers. The agricultural industry was the only industry, really, along with coal, in the United States in the 1920s that was not enjoying the boom times and the good times with the rest of the country. And there were two reasons for that. First, during the war years in 1914 to 1918, farmers enjoyed an incredible boom. Farm production in Europe went significantly down, decreased significantly during the war because the nations were fighting the war. And American farm output, picked up the slack, and the price of farm goods went up. The demand for farm goods went up, so American farmers responded by planting more crops and selling more crops, and made pretty good money. When the war ended and European farms got back on their feet, the need for American agricultural products overseas was obviously lessened. And all of a sudden there was a glut of supply with a limited demand. And anytime you have a glut of supply, too much supply, a surplus of supply, a surplus in this case of agricultural goods, and not enough people demanding them, the price for those goods obviously goes down. Another problem farmers were having was that in order to keep up with new trends, farmers had to invest in a lot of new technology. And the picture over here is a man driving a gasoline tractor in the early 1920s on his farm. These things were expensive, and farmers had to borrow money to buy them. And they had bought them in the late teens during times were good, and they were forced to buy them in the 20s, when times were less good, on credit. When their crops were not worth as much as they thought they were worth, obviously it became very difficult for the farmers to make payments on not only perhaps the mortgages on their farms, but the payments on their new equipment. And throughout the 1920s, farmers lived in this ever-deepening cycle of debt. And you can rest assured that when the rest of the country's economy went into the toilet in the early 1930s, the farmers who had not been doing well in the 1920s were hit even harder than ever. The farmers were frustrated. Farmers always are living with forces outside of their control. And these large economic forces that are shaping, the economy of the United States is largely outside the control of farmers. And so they look for political solutions. And one of the things that they came up with was a government agency known as the Federal Farm Board. And the Federal Farm Board was an agency of the Department of Agriculture. This is one of those examples that, Presidents Harding and Coolidge were not as laissez-faire as their critics and their caricatures tend to have made them. And the Federal Farm Board offered farmers insurance against acts of God. Floods, freezing, too much rain, drought. It offered farmers insurance against nature. That if farmers bought into the program, that if they had a bad harvest due to natural catastrophes, they would still be paid so they could keep their farms and keep their way of life. It did not insure against bad farming, and it did not provide any sort of restriction on supply to get the markets back into equilibrium. It was a government-run insurance program to prevent farmers from losing everything if there was acts of God, acts of nature that they could not control on their farms. Congress, spurred on by the farming states, passed a bill known as the Mcnairy-Hogan bill. And the Mcnairy-Hogan bill was an attempt to raise the price of farm goods artificially. And what the idea here was that if farmers produced too much, if farmers produced a surplus of goods, that surplus of goods would be bought by the government. It would be bought by the government, and then it would be sold overseas. Bought by the government at the world price. All farm goods have a commodity price. It changes, every day. What a bushel of corn costs on the world market, etc., etc. This bill, the Mcnairy-Hogan bill, was a bill that would have the government buy. Remember, the farmers are now producing too much stuff. The government would buy the extra stuff at the world rate and then sell it overseas. It did not become law. It was vetoed twice by President Coolidge. President Coolidge said, based on his laissez-faire understanding of the American government, that the federal government has no such role or responsibility it does not have a constitutional, it's not allowed constitutionally to buy crops from farmers at an artificial rate, at a non-market rate, and then sell them. Coolidge saw it as an imposition of the federal government on the workings of the American economy. The bill passed Congress twice. Coolidge vetoed it twice, and Congress could not override the veto. So this never became law. This never became the law of the land in the United States. And obviously, it did not endear President Coolidge to farmers.